Thank you. Okay, dear colleagues, welcome to a series of online interviews. We are going to discuss how present situation may influence international activities in higher education. I'm Larissa Taradina, Director for International Education and Cooperation at RANEPA, and here with me Anna Chernyakhovskaya, the host of RANEPA Expert Talks, and we will be the moderators today. These interviews, the follow-up of RANEPA conference, Internationalization of Russian Higher Education, Goals, Engagement and Impact. The conference was supposed to be held at the beginning of April, but was postponed due to the pandemic situation. So, crucial that such sphere as international higher education will be greatly affected by the situation. And now I want to introduce our experts. Vladimir Mau, Rector of the Russian Presidential Academy of National Economy and Public Administration. Philip Albach, Founding Director of the Center for International Higher Education at Boston College. Hans David, Present Director of the Center for International Higher Education at Boston College, and Sergei Misaedov, Vice Rector of RANEPA, Director of RANEPA International Business School, IBS Moscow, and President of the Russian Association of Business Education. I would also like to mention that here with us is our RANEPA international team, as well as the representatives of RANEPA media who are interested in the current developments in internationalization of higher education. We are also broadcasting our interviews live on RANEPA website and YouTube. Dear colleagues, Anna and I are going to ask you several questions, and however, if you would like to add something to a topic after one of the experts, and please raise your hand and feel free to do so. Now let us proceed to the questions. And first questions goes to Vladimir Mau. Vladimir Alexandrovich, now all educational processes are organized online. How will it affect education in the nearest future?
Thank you very much. First of all, I wanted to greet our colleagues with whom we have been working for quite a long time, particularly Hans David, who was part of our development team when our academy 10 years ago was created by the president of the big network organized academy for management science. Thank you very much again. I do believe that we will have a good longer period of cooperation. First of all, speaking about the influence of this pandemic case, speaking on rapid development of online education in current circumstances, I would stress, and I wanted to put some broader terms which is based on this experience of distant learning, online learning, but broader than it is. First of all, I would say that we observe, we notice the continuation of the trends which we could notice in previous, say, 5 or even more years, but this is a rapid acceleration of these trends. I would, being economic historian, I would compare this, say, with World War I, for instance. World War I created a lot of new economic institutions, and some of them were considered as an institutions only for warfare, but it turned out that many of them existed for next almost 100 years. State regulation of the economy, what was in Russia called war communism, or something like this. So we see now some acceleration of previous trends, and some of these trends will last for quite a long period of time, some of them not, and it's important not to confuse one and another. And one of the risks is to overestimate, both underestimate and overestimate the trends we now face with. And it's very important to see difference between anti-crisis and decisions, anti-pandemic measures and decisions. As economist, I wanted to stress that actually this is not economic crisis, this is economic consequences of pandemic crisis, and it is quite different things comparing to, say, 2008, 2009, global financial crisis. And looking from this perspective, of course, the shift to online education seems a very important one, but there are different various consequences of this online or distant education. I will say something later about this particular case, this particular trend. But first of all, what I see, and which seems to me very important, is the development, the increasing of competition on education market. And it's not only internal competition between universities, and it's not only international competition, because the more access is to online programs, the stronger international competition we see. But it's also the non-branch, non-educational competition, because now we see, again, we noticed it during last 10 years, but now I do believe it will accelerate. We see the increasing participation in educational market of non-educational institutions. It's interesting to compare, say, with banking sector, because if you look at banks, we see more and more technological high-tech companies which intervene into banking sector. As some bankers say, 10 years later, there will be banking services, but not traditional banks. And we see the same with university. The more our clients, our students need skills and not formal degrees, the more other firms which are not from educational areas, say technological companies, for instance, or banks which are diversifying their activity, they come to educational market and they offer their services. And this type of competition, particularly in online cases, is getting more and more important. And I see the main challenge, for instance, for our institute, which is quite big. We have about 200,000 students per year of various programs, not only degree, of course, programs, but various types of training and retraining. My main concern is, of course, the competition from out of education area. Not the universities, but non-university institutions. I see also trend for polarization and fractioning of universities, because I see that it will be, we can see it even from the shift to online education. Those universities who easily shifted, change their organizational form, and shifted to online education, not just education by pen, by mail, but real online education, distant learning, which is online distant learning and not out of direct contact. And the universities which shifted just for very old style traditional education, and professors send their courses by email and get response by email. So this is different form. So I would expect polarization of the institutions, and of course active development of online program. Of course, everybody now is concerned about prospects of offline education. There are some well-known institutions and professors who believe in total online future. So some of my colleagues are on this track. For instance, rector of High School of Economics, a good friend of mine, he believes in a total future of online. my own experience and experience of long economic history says that people often overestimate the term of crisis, but underestimate the particular case of their own crisis. So it's, well, you know, since we're in Boston, the late Rudy Dornbush, a good friend of mine, once said that the second law of economic forecast says that crisis happens later than you predict, but earlier than you expect. And I think that we can use this phrase for broader assessment of current transformation, current challenges of education. We made a sociological research 2 weeks ago, asking teachers, asking professors about their what's happened with them with the shift to total online education. And our colleagues from High School of Economics in Moscow, they did the same for students. We shared the field. The interesting point is that they got response from 11,000 students, and we got response from 30,000 professors. It was an open response, and professors reported 3 times more active, although there are much more students, of course, in the country than professors. But again, we have 30,000 professors. 3,000 out of them are professors of our network, of this academy, 27,000 are professors of the whole Russian universities and graduates. If you don't mind, I would share with some of the results. They're quite interesting. First of all, of course, professors were ready for this shift because all of them are active users of different gadgets, of different online facilities. So it was not very difficult for them. But 7% of them hope to come back to offline education. What is 98% said that has mentioned that they completely shift to online, and only 1% saying that it's a partial online. Again, it very much depends what they consider as a complete online shift, but it means they do not have contact lectures. But if we 87% believes that that offline format is better. Again, 98 shifted completely to online, but 87% believe that the offline is better. We measured the sort of psychological index of acceptance of online education, to what extent it is psychologically comfortable to them. 88% said that it is psychologically uncomfortable. 88% do not like it. They are ready to work in it, they do work in it, but they do not like it. And it is not a huge shift between professions, between areas of specializations. Those who accept it more much better than others are IT professors, which is understandable, I think, and which is interesting, military professors who are in military academies. Maybe it is a discipline in military academies. Roughly 78% of military and IT professors accepted, have negative psychological response, comparing to 88 in general. But those who are mostly against, who feel mostly uncomfortable, roughly 94 to 96%, are professors of human studies, which is understandable. And which is less understandable are professors of mathematics. ITs are more comfortable. Those who are in math, they are mostly uncomfortable, and that's also quite interesting result. 86% of professors says that they have now less free time and that their work is much more intense than in offline situation. 43% says that current situation will decrease the quality of university education. The current situation which education faced with. And only 15% believe that situation will become better 1 year from now. So these are the brief results of our analysis. I would not spend time presenting my colleagues' analysis of the students. It's more neutral. Some of them says yes, some no. Of course, what we are concerned about is the prospects of the students' mobility. Of course, if we believe in online education, the mobility could increase, but of course, in physical terms, it creates some important problems. And the last but not the least point is that, of course, the main challenge, to my mind, the main challenge to professional education is even not online and offline, is unpredictability of development of technologies and labor market. If we still have, say, 6 years of education at the university, bachelor and master's level, about PhD program, we know that when students enter the university, many professions which will be important and very profitable when he or she graduates doesn't exist at all. It is the real challenge to our education. It means that we should not teach just narrow profession, but teach to be successful, which means to be to feel the challenges and to adapt to challenges. And to my mind, this is the main question for us. And online is only one of the instruments which could contribute or could prevent from this education. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Vladimir Alexandrovich. Before I will move to another question, if anybody wants to comment or add anything, let me know.
Well, just a small comment from me. From what I read in the American higher education press, the reactions of US professors to the online is rather similar to what you reported, Vladimir, from Russia. That is, yes, they're doing it. No, they're not very happy with it, and it means less free time for them, and it's they see it as more or less problematical.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So let me add to that, and then I agree with Phil, and I also see that in other parts of the world, that we see similar kind of reactions by faculty and also by students. So students also are not really happy with the online provision because they have all kind of problems with both the quality of the online connections, the facilities at home, how to deal with education, and the fact that they are not used, the faculty are not used, and they are not used to online education makes it very uncertain for them, and they feel very uncomfortable. So the trend is there. If you look then to what you said, I think also we have to make a distinction between undergraduate and graduate. I think in particular at the undergraduate level, the challenges to move completely to online education are nearly impossible, because at the undergraduate level, students need much more interaction with their faculty in person. They need much more interaction with their students in person. They need the kind of cohort feeling of community and having also outside of the classroom much more interaction. So for undergraduate education, I think it would have an enormous negative impact if you would do completely an online education. At the graduate level, it might be different by master programs, which have a much more professional approach. It might be much more easier, and it's already happening even before this crisis. But in other ones, it might also be difficult because they also need much more the interaction in laboratoria, etc. So I agree with you that there's an oversimplification and over-expectation that this crisis will lead to a replacement of offline to online education. That's not going to happen in the way that people think that's going to happen. There will be some impact, but not the enormous impact that people think.
And can I make one other comment, which I think underlies this whole discussion, and that is, we really cannot think of higher education in aggregate. We can't think of the whole system. We have to think of the segments of the higher education system. And this crisis broadly, and also the online little part of it, and we're going to be getting to the internationalization soon, they will affect different parts of the system in quite different ways. And I think we need to be sophisticated in how we analyze and how those of us who are in the different parts of the system understand. So broadly, by country, broadly by segment, there are going to be differences. And we have to really think of how these different parts, a research university is going to be affected differently than a small private college, for example, in the US context. And we have to understand that the system, it's not a system, it's a differentiated group of institutions.
Of course, the most clear case is a special situation in medical schools, because medicine online is, maybe it is also possible because there are some technologies. But among the new jokes in Russia about profession and education on distant and homework, one of the specialists said that his family doesn't like when he makes his job from his house. But what is your profession? I'm pathologoanatomist. So this is the ultimate case. What seems to be important, we also did mention that postgraduate education, for instance, for us, MBA and MPA programs are very important. It is one of the key parts of our activity, but we perfectly know that for this program, for leading MBA and MPA programs, the personal contact of the audience is not less important, sometimes even more important than contacts with professor. You can bring professor online, but they need direct communication. They need the atmosphere for creating teams, and it is a very special, very important case for us, which I didn't raise at all.
So, thank you very much for your comments. And now I would like to move to the next question. And next question to you, Phil. How do you see internationalization of education in the current circumstances?
Well, Hans should also comment on this, obviously. There are going to be significant changes in the short run, and I think in the long run as well. And again, as I said before, they will affect different countries and different parts of systems in different institutions in different ways. First point, there will definitely be a decline in student mobility. at least for a while. Second point, the countries which have depended on international student numbers for financial reasons, especially Australia, the UK, and to a somewhat lesser extent in parts of the US system, will be negatively affected quite significantly. And there are going to be big adjustments for that. It may be, and Hans can discuss more, changes in the way that internationalization is understood. So let me stop with that and ask Hans to comment.
Hans, could you please?
I will add to that. I agree with Phil that if you look at only the mobility side, so international student mobility, there will be an enormous impact in the short term, and there will be shifts in the long term. I make that this distinction because the impact will be that there will be at the short term less mobility, and that has to do also with the financial aspects. Mobility costs money, and a lot of people, in particular in the developing and emerging countries, and those are the ones that are moving, will be affected negatively by the crisis, and so many of them cannot afford to go abroad. So that will be an enormous impact. In the long term, there might be some recovery going on, but then, even then, people will choose for different destinations than going to the traditional European and North American, Australia, New Zealand countries, because they will feel that the costs are still too high. They feel not very safe and welcome anymore. So it creates opportunities, in my view, that students will go much more to other parts of the world. So they will move much more to Asia. They move much more within Latin America, within Africa. It might create opportunities for Russian higher education as well. But it all depends on also how students perceive the situation in those countries with respect to wellness and safety. That will be an important part, certainly in the short term, for decisions of students, much more than there was the quality of education focus. So, and it will be interesting to see. But and also plays a role. What you see now in India and China, for instance, where there is a lot of racism against African students and African immigrants, that they might say, well, we don't go there because that's also unsafe. So welcoming is also an important part of that trend. But overall, I would say international student mobility will be affected, but the impact will be different in many countries. And I think it certainly will have an enormous impact on Australia, the UK, and as Phil said, certain parts of the United States, where because they have become so dependent on the revenue for the sustainability of the quality of higher education, that if the numbers drop as they are indicating, then that will have an impact on the quality of education they can provide. I don't think it will impact Harvard or Yale or other top research universities. They will still have the possibility to give scholarships. They will still have the attractiveness of being high quality. But many other institutions in the second layer and the third layer, and particularly at the bottom end, they will be impacted by this development. But of course, there are other aspects of internationalization we can discuss later, but this is on the international student mobility, that's certainly the case. Phil?
Yeah, and I think governmental policy will play a role. And of course, the rise of Mr. Trump and nationalism in general, the debates going on in the UK about policies towards immigration and so on. And as Hans said, the welcomeness, if you want to call it that, of national policy will make a difference. And again, other countries, maybe Russia, but certainly continental European countries, can take advantage of these of these, in our view, kind of negative trends at the governmental level. And the other point, which Hans mentioned a little bit, is the segmentation. And this is true not only for the US, but for all countries. That is, in my view, in our view, the top of the top universities worldwide are going to do, generally speaking, okay, in terms of attracting students, and also, by the way, of attracting scientists and faculty. And the rest of the system is going to be affected, probably in the long run, even fairly negatively by this. And we might also want to talk about mobility and international collaboration and cooperation of professors, which will be affected by this. The dispute between the United States and China at the moment, which in my view is going to absolutely get worse and be a big problem going forward, will make a difference in terms of US-China research collaboration, which has been fairly significant, and may affect the way that other scholars from even other parts of the world see the US as a welcoming place for research collaboration. So I think we in the US have a very serious problem, and our policy direction at the moment is going totally in the wrong direction.
Yeah, and if I may add one example of where I see a country that might be benefiting from this whole process is South Korea. South Korea was interesting. It has moved over the past 2 decades from a sending country of international students abroad to increasing their own quality, and for demographic reasons not having enough students going abroad, and was trying to work on attracting international students. And that might be now very successful because they are the best example how they have been attacking the coronavirus. So if there's not going to be a second wave in South Korea, students might feel that that's a much better place to go than other countries because it's good quality education. It's in Asia, which is the booming region, etc. So all those factors of national policies, how they have dealing with the crisis, etc., have an impact on what students' choices are, because there will be a pull factor for them to go to different countries than they normally would have thought about.
Yeah, and one point which Hans has raised in several different ways, which I really think we should underline, and that is students are going to think in more broadly about what choices they're making about where to study. And this issue, of course, the issue of health is going to come into it. The issue of safety, which is maybe related to health, but to other things. The issue of racism, as he mentioned, with regard to India and China and sort of racial incidents against African students at the moment, and so on. This is going to enter much more, I think, into the way people think about where to go. And that hasn't been so much part of the equation so far.
Phil, Hans, thank you so much. And you've already started the developing of the issue. And now my next question goes to Sergei Pavlovich. So let's continue with the new challenges for higher and international education, and especially today. What do you think?
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor for me to participate in such a great conversation with such outstanding specialists. Just several observations about the challenges for the education in the coming future. I consider that coronavirus is just part of the challenge because it came simultaneously with the world economic crisis and with the end of Kondratyev's big wave. And so we can expect the radical change of value system and behavioral patterns of both students and new generation of the faculties in the future. And now when I'm thinking about the challenge for the international education, and can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. And now,
Yes.
thank you very much. And now when I'm thinking about the great challenge for the international education of the world and for business education of the world in particular, because for the last 3 decades, I was working in the field of business education, I can say that, first of all, we face the challenge connected with VUCA environment, fantastic growth of uncertainty, when prediction of the future is very difficult. And very often we're moving like when you're walking across the swamp or across the marsh, where when you just step very, very carefully, looking for which direction is more safe for that particular period of time. Second thing, this is radical change of ecosystem. Third thing, this is radical change of our climate and nature. And from my point of view, coronavirus is maybe one of the replies of nature to the challenges of human beings, which were created recently. And who can say today whether coronavirus epidemic strike is the final one? Who can say for sure that we won't meet within the coming future some other epidemics coming? This is environment, this is ecosystem. And now we're coming to the mentality challenges. We, within international business education, and it seems to me I have certain right to speak about international business education, not only about the Russian one, because I am member of 3 international advisory boards of 2 big associations of business schools, comprising the leading one, SASB International, and of 2 business schools which are our partners. And I listen to what the people are talking. We face the very strong challenge of generation change. Those millennials and Zoomers who are coming, they have different perception of life. They have different value system. And when we start making research, and I guess you know that better than I do, we find out that their whole perception of life, of what is happiness and what is unhappiness, and what they'd like to reach, differs very much from the perception of the life my generation, and I'm 66 today, my generation had a different one. Absolutely. Next, we have now a great challenge to mobility, which partially we can bridge together by the use of distant technologies. Instead of traveling, we can talk just like we're talking with you. We can invite the best specialists to our visual or virtual rooms for lecturing. We have organized international conferences of students, provided they speak English, but with artificial intelligence, their translation won't be that difficult. Next thing, we're coming to the research. You see, I'm not a specialist in research. I know that Phil is one of the top world specialists of the research of international education. Once again, I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen. Can you hear me? Something is floating on my screen.
Yeah.
Yes, great. Thank you very much. I want to talk for a long time. So Phil, thank you for this great opportunity to communicate with you directly. It's for the first in my life, and I care and value it very, very much. When I'm thinking about the research as far as international business education is concerned, I consider that within this post-Immanuel Wallerstein world, and I'm very unhappy, once again, I'm very unhappy that we're leaving this world with more or less fixed principles, which I fear, created by Immanuel Wallerstein. But in this world, when the country are started thinking about their identity, I consider that the world business education, maybe university education, can help the other parts of the world about the development of this self-identity. I shall explain what I mean. Say, we were teaching in Russia. In Russia, we have dozens of good business schools, which can be by the level of quality, be plus minus within the first 50 of European business schools. However, what all those businesses are doing, they are repeating MBA programs as far as structure and stresses, copying the top world business schools MBA programs. And from this point of view, they cannot give anything really of value to the rest of the world. We do not have today any research, of real research at micro level, of the peculiarities of, say, Russian or Commonwealth of Independent States, or Middle East, or Eastern European model of management. Outside of Bert Hofstadter model with 5 parameters, is too general. How does the people at the level of small and medium-sized management, whom we call the hidden champions of the 21st century, how they behave in this or that part of the world, how they behave in this or that branch of industry, if their model of behavior in Russia or in Middle Asia different from the model of behavior of other national managers who are working within the biggest companies and who are working within the joint venture companies. And I heard a lot of discussions of this sort of research, but maybe with the exception of several small articles of Mr. Minko from Bulgaria, I didn't see anything reasonable that can be provided for the companies when they are coming to invest to this or that country of the world. And maybe if you could advise us how to do that and could become the head, I mean mental head, spiritual head of such a research, I would be very, very happy to support it on behalf of RABE, Russian Association of Business Education. Just this is win-win approach. For us, this is our export opportunities. If we learn more about local and regional models of management, we'll be advising companies, both Russian, Western, and Eastern, about those peculiarities. And today we have only general theoretical researches. Next thing, I consider that for the that would be the last one. I consider that for the next step of the international education, we have to think about how to make interaction of our faculties using distant opportunities more close, to create better awareness about what is happening in different countries of the world. It's my personal feeling, and I wonder whether you would share it or not. We cannot today really judge business schools of the world and programs of the business schools of the world by the present day rankings. Even those which are at the very top, like Financial Times, at all the conferences, World Conference, we are talking about that. They take you a lot of money, a lot of energy, practically for nothing. Instead of working for our clients, we are spending our time for all those things. I'm not speaking about the second part of rankings like QS, Ed Universal. I played at Universal for some time, and they left. I don't like what is happening inside. And it's not personal. I heard a lot about that within the Russian Association of Business Education. And let us introduce our faculties to each other. Let they create better awareness about what is happening at different parts of the world. Small personal observation, dear ladies and gentlemen. It so happened that I speak English, Russian, and can understand French. So every morning I start watching programs, news programs in Russian, in English, BBC and CNN. In French, this is France 24. And I compare what they say. It is a very interesting way of research because the programs provide you different pictures of the world. Let us think how to establish direct links among the academics. Let them create direct awareness about what is happening at the universities on the other side. I consider it could bring a very, very good result. I'm sorry for a little bit hectic intervention. Thank you very, very much for your attention. And I would be very, very much pleased to cooperate with you to make mutual projects in research, in faculty exchange, in students exchange, in cooperation between EIA and RABE, Russian Association of Business Education, with the support of RENEPA, the biggest management university of our country with enormous potential in research and faculty teaching. I consider we can make several very, very valuable steps together, provided that you help us a little bit and provided that we shall find some win-win and mutually beneficial ways. Thank you very, very much.
Sergey Pavlovich, thank you very much for your passionate and deep speech, actually. So, dear colleagues who would like to comment or just develop the ideas of Sergey Pavlovich.
Well, just one brief comment. Of course, I am not an expert on management education at all, but it is clear that globally, and particularly in the United States, there is a huge crisis, as he implied, in business education. Thinking about what it should do, and of course, in the U.S. context, in most business schools, even top-end ones, enrollments are declining, and people are not clear what should be the direction of business education. So it's and this is all before the COVID crisis, and it will be even more after it. But this particular field, this is not the topic of today's conversation, but this particular field is in particular special crisis at the moment.
Yeah, and if I may add to that, I mean, what he described for the business education applies to other fields as well. And there has been a tendency that there is a copying of the mainstream paradigms in business education, in engineering, in philosophy, and in all disciplines, copying from the North American, Western European approach, instead of developing own paradigms and own additions to the paradigm. And what you see now as a reaction is that we are moving to the other side. We're going from a global perspective on the dominant paradigms of the Western world to each other developing their own nationalist paradigm. And both are bad. You cannot have one that is dominated at the global level by certain paradigms from the Western part, moving to a whole diversity of different paradigms, which are much more ideological, political, nationalist, etc. You have to find the right balance between local and global. And that has to happen in the business education sector and the business in general, but it also has to happen more in other disciplines. So we have to collaborate, as Sergey says, much more in looking at from different angles to perspectives, and by that being innovative and change-oriented to a new and better world. And that also relates to a question which I saw passing by about how do we bring in the sustainable development goals in this context? So how can we, as higher education, in particular now with the COVID-19 crisis, help to make the sustainable development goals possible? There is a big fear, and Philip and I have been writing about that in our contribution to University Worldview, that if the COVID-19 crisis is only short-term, that everybody goes back to business as usual. because that's the first inclination. So we forget about online education, we forget about the fact that we should not recruit international students for revenue, etc. We all go back to the same business, and that's a danger if we don't learn from this crisis that research collaboration is essential for solving this crisis, but also for helping the world to become a better world. So we should not move from one reaction to the other reaction, which very many nationalists are doing, but we really should stimulate collaboration internationally in research and in education for the Sustainable Development Goals. That's, I think, an important lesson we have to learn from this crisis, that is necessary, but I'm very much afraid that political factors of nationalism around the world will try to avoid that. And that's why, like Phil says, it's also very dangerous, this increased tension between China and the United States, which is not good for the world overall, and it's not good for science, because we have to collaborate to solve problems together.
Thank you so much. And I mean, we've touched, so broad actually issues, and we talked about the future, but let's get back to the current situation. And so, Phil, in your opinion, what steps should be undertaken right away? I mean, for universities to go through the crisis with less damage? What should be done today?
Well, if I had a good answer to that question, I would be winning a Nobel Prize in education or management, which don't exist. Clearly, universities need to understand where they are, as I've said before, in the broader system in which they operate. So, and maybe this crisis will get them to focus more clearly on what they want to do and how they can contribute both to their own survival, which will be a problem in many instances, and to contributing to their goals and to create their goals in the broader context. Hans said about the sustainable development, which is very important, but universities, as he also implied, are going to be thinking about their own survival. Clearly, everywhere, there's going to be financial problems for higher education, because governments are spending lots of money just to keep their societies and economies floating at the moment, and eventually they're going to have to. They and we are going to have to pay for this, and it's not quite clear how that is. And universities are going to need to think again, as I said, about what they really want to do as goals for themselves and as a contribution to their students and for the society. It's estimated in the US that there will be a decline in student numbers, at least temporarily, as students are rethinking whether it's safe to come back to university, how they're going to study, whether they can afford it in the, since so many families are now unemployed and so on. So universities are going to have to deal with that. Many countries have a very large private higher education sector. And that sector, except for the top private institutions, which are very, very few, are going to suffer dramatic difficulties, and many of them are not going to survive. By the way, some of them don't deserve to survive, but that's another discussion. So we are facing quite important changes, and as Sergei pointed out before, and Vladimir also, these problems predate COVID, and they are going to be magnified by it.
Yeah, if I may add to that, I think crises like this also are serving a certain purpose to clean up things. So So as Phil said, there are a lot of bad providers of private higher education. There are also several bad public higher education providers, but in particular in the private sector, there will be a cleanup. In the United States, some people even predict that 20% of the higher education sector will be closed. Maybe that's an exaggeration and we don't know exactly, but we will see that in particular in the rest of the world, private poor providers will be suffering most because people will not come to them anymore. The same as with the discussion we had at the start about online education. We don't think that, and I think we all agree about that online education will not replace offline education. It will, at the same time, create opportunities to use online much more in combination with offline, so much more a hybrid model of education. And that might be a positive impact of this whole crisis, that it accelerates a process that already was going on. And where more and more institutions were using online as part of their curriculum, a part of their coursework, so bringing in foreign faculty to give online guest lectures, bring in foreign students from other campuses, the collaborative online international learning opportunities. Maybe we start to learn that that is much more better than really replacing offline by online, to integrate the online into the offline education, which benefits everybody much better. So what institutions have to do, and what leaders of institutions of higher education and national governments have to look at, what lessons can we learn to improve the quality of higher education, instead of getting into this kind of crisis management by trying to do things, bringing it back to usual. I think we have to learn, but it is not a process that will be very easy, because the first reaction of everybody will be, as soon as possible, going back to normal.
Thank you very much. And you see, we have some very interesting questions in our chat. So I want to ask you to answer to some of them. One question which I think is very interesting is, do you see virtual mobility replacing traditional mobility in the nearest future?
My short answer to that is not really. As we said, there'll be a decline for a while in actual mobility, and I think that the sort of boom, rapid expansion of student mobility that we've seen in the last decade or so is going to come to an end. There will still be increases, but those increases will be less dramatic. And as Hans has said, there's going to be some change in the direction of mobility. I worry a lot about, in the US context, the future of study abroad. Our American students, and I suppose Hans can comment more about the EU, students are going to be less excited about going to other countries for part of their study, for safety reasons, for financial reasons, and so on. So let me stop there.
If I may add to that, I mean, the study abroad part, which is much more mobility for credits at home, so not the full degree mobility, but 6 weeks or a semester or a year abroad for your home degrees, which is quite common in the US, with something like 10% of the student population making use of that. And it's also quite common in Europe, in particular thanks to the Erasmus scheme. I think in the US, the impact will be much higher. The US study abroad scheme is much more focused on undergraduate mobility, and parents will be very worried, given what they have seen happening in the past months, that students were stuck, couldn't go back home. There were financial consequences. It had impact on their credit points, etc. So I think the impact of study abroad in the United States might be very strong, that it will drastically drop. and will be only going to certain safe countries, but a much more limited number. And that's too bad, because study abroad was going up in the United States, although much more for shorter periods than for long periods. In Europe, I think the Erasmus scheme will have less of an impact. There will be not an increase in funding as originally was planned, I think, because of the financial problems. But the Erasmus scheme as such will continue, and students will still be mobile much more within the European context because of the scholarships and available. So there the impact will be less negative than in the United States study abroad. And it impacts a lot of people, because now many study abroad offices in the United States that have a lot of staff and assistants, etc., they will have to close or have to reduce drastically their support, and there will be a lot of people without jobs in that area. And if there will be also a lot of organizations and companies that are dealing with that will have to close. An example, the Council for International Educational Exchange, one of the biggest providers of study abroad in the United States, already fired 600 people. And other organizations are closing as well. So I think the impact in the United States will be very big, less in Europe and less in the rest of the world. And of course, in the rest of the world, there were far less numbers of mobility for study abroad. UK, Australia, Canada, but also developing countries didn't have that kind of big schemes like Erasmus or the tradition of study abroad. So that will not change too much. And that has always been a very elitist approach. But I think the impact in the United States will be the biggest.
Yeah, and one thing also implied by the original question, this may provide an opportunity for virtual study abroad and mobility and collaboration of different kinds. There are already some little tiny programs in these areas, but this may be useful, for example, for Russia in terms of introducing Russian students to colleagues in different countries and making more sophisticated use of emerging technologies to do that. So this is a kind of a small opportunity in a difficult situation.
Thank you very much. And I have one more question. Do you think that online education will be adopted more broadly in the future because of its low cost relative to offline? And question from me, do you think that online education should be cheaper, or it should be the same price as offline?
It's an interesting discussion. I think people are very naive on that. We've seen, and that's basically also what the survey which Vladimir presented says, that faculty perceive that online education is also very time demanding, because you have to prepare yourself much better, you have to have a much more interaction with your students outside of the classroom. I mean, I noticed it as well when my teaching online, that it cost me more time, and I hear that from my colleagues in Boston College as well, than regular education. And people think, well, yeah, but that's only because you do it the first time. But I do it already for several years, and I noticed that is not going to change. So in that sense, the faculty costs will continue. You might not have so much of an infrastructure in the campus, but you need to have much more mechanisms to communicate with students, etc. So I think the assumption that the cost will be lower can be questioned. And secondly, we have not seen yet in the world that quality online education has become cheaper than offline education. In general, there is no distinction in tuition fees between offline and online. So I don't think that's going to happen.
Yeah, and just to underline just for a moment, I agree totally with what Hans just said, and it's really these are very important points. Good online education is not cheaper than in person education. There may be economies of scale going forward and so on. Point one. Point two, the customer, that is students and their families, think that online should be cheaper because, you know, it's that way. But in fact, it isn't. And academic institutions are going to have to think through the pricing structure of it. And it's not an easy discussion for the reasons Hans mentioned, for the reasons that Vladimir indicated from the, you know, from his survey and so on. And there's going to be pushback from the faculty, you know, as we get deeper into this.
If I may add, you know, there are three different types of these questions. First of all, there will be the part of the story is differentiation of the university. There will be cheap universities which will become cheap, and more expensive universities which will become more expensive, because for us now this is more expensive universities education, at least based on costs. Another issue is for students. For students and their families, it might be cheaper, but not because the university education is cheaper, but because some of them could stay at home and not spending money on living facilities in the universities, in the campuses, etc. It may be cheaper for those students who choose online education because of the additional costs of living, etc., etc. But not for the university. If a good education is not cheap. Good online education will not be cheap. This is for sure, and that's what we do, which we insist over the time. But for particular students, it could be cheaper because they will stay at home with their parents.
Yeah, I think for specific students in particular, I think at the graduate level, like I said, professional master programs, the online might be cheaper. Although what we see in many of those programs that at the end, students and faculty say, well, okay, you can do the program online, but you need to have also moments that you see each other offline. And then you get the travel expenses to spend a week or 2 weeks at the campus. So people are a little bit naive that there is either offline or online. The combination, as I said before, is better, but that also brings costs. So, but at the end, you are absolutely right. There will be very poor quality online education cheap. Like we also have very poor quality offline education cheap by private providers. Yes. That market will continue to exist, and probably that online might be even increasing. We see that already in many countries which call themselves private institutions, which are mainly online providers. I know that in Latin America, for instance. But that are very poor quality providers. Yeah, that's not what we see as the future, I would say.
Let me thank those who organized this conference, ladies, particularly you.
Thank you very much, Vladimir Alexandrovich. Thank you very much to everyone for participation. I think it's been a very fruitful and useful dialogue. And yes, we will continue our online discussions on the development of higher education internationalization, and we will share the results with you and with other colleagues working in international higher education.
And let me use this opportunity to think a bit about one very positive thing about this online education. I wanted to invite our two colleagues, I mean Hans and Phil, to lecture a bit at our academy, because now we see that we can easily organize it through online. Of course, we would be more than happy to see you offline in Moscow or in any other our campus in this country. But let me ask you to continue our context and to present your views in our autumn semester.
Thank you, with pleasure. And I think you are right, that's maybe one of the more positive lectures of this crisis, that suddenly we see that we can bring in faculty from all over the world to collaborate with faculty in teaching and in research online. We don't have to travel as much anymore, and that's also good for the planet. So in that sense, this might be positive sign, and we're welcome to do that.
Yes, yes. And the expansion of webinars like this one and others, which are all over the place, and I know that Hans particularly has been kind of nonstop engaged in such things. That's a positive development for the reasons he just mentioned, and can help us in many ways. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, and take care and stay safe.
And
Thank you.
see you soon online and hopefully offline in a while.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.